In around the year 1600, two brothers named Ahmed and Muhammad Said travelled from the Caspian coast in Persia to Ayutthaya, at the time the capital of Siam. Ahmed's descendants later became known as the Bunnags, a family who rose to prominence and became part of the Siamese elite. For this reason, their story follows that of the Thai nation through the fall of Ayutthaya and the relocation of the capital first to Thonburi and then to Bangkok. Shane Bunnag's Chariot of the Sun is a chronicle of his family's history and, by extension, of the Thai capitals, but it's also a profound reflection on the nature of memory itself. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode, I invite an author or expert to give their views on the work of literature, and today I'm joined by Shane Bunnag, author of Chariot of the Sun. I hope our conversation inspires you to read it, and if you have anything to say about the text or our conversation, please leave a comment below the video. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Shane Bunnag is a visual artist, filmmaker and writer, as well as a National Geographic explorer. His documentary films have been broadcast internationally, and his video and photographic works are exhibited in the Jim Thompson Foundation's collection and the Siam Contemporary Art Museum. He's written for the Nikkei Asian Review and the Journal of the Siam Society, among other publications. Chariot of the Sun is his first book, but hopefully not his last. It's a pleasure to welcome Shane to the World Literature Podcast. Warm welcome to the World Literature Podcast. Great to have you on and to be talking about Chariot of the Sun.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Could you just start by telling us a little bit about the book, why you think people might be interested, who might be interested in it?
Well, I'm not a very good salesman of the book, and it's been very interesting because people have read it outside of the Thai context and they have a very different response to it. Some of them love it, some of them know me and like it, and I think it is quite specific to Thailand, and it was specific to a certain moment in time. And I'd say one of the unique things about the book is that I was able to do it very quickly, partly because it was COVID and I had all this time on my hands. And also just the way, I was helped a little bit with the research. So it was, kind of contacting family, and I managed to gather together the materials and write it in 3 months and then have it published, so 6 months later, which is quite a unique thing. And, so I think if anything, it does definitely represent a certain sort of coherence of thought and time. But the book itself, if it was in a bookshop, it would probably be in the memoir section, which I find unsatisfying, but it is. And it's something of a history. So I called it an informal history because it's not academic, but I'm kind of using some of the sources in a semi-academic way. I studied history once upon a time. I studied archaeology, so there's a little bit of that in there. On the historical side, it follows the journey of a Thai family from around 1600, originally Persian, and then up through the fall of Ayutthaya into the Bangkok era, kind of decline and fall of a noble family into the 20th century when we're just like everybody else, confused and kind of losing our thread. So yeah, it's a mixture of Thai history and memoir. It's a mixture of source material and then intangible things about life in Thailand. Should people read it? Definitely, because it will inspire them to go and write their own, or perhaps not feel, hung up about whether or not it's going to be marketable, or, whether an agent or a publisher will like it. I didn't write it like that. I just wrote it and didn't know what I would do with it. I didn't know if I'd show it to people, but I managed to get it out there. And I think also that, I'd like to inspire people to look at Thai history in a different way, that it can be quite constrictive, and there's a certain idea about Thai history as being, about sort of great men and, and always being about, sort of a limited number of figures. And actually, I found it was very diverse and very inspiring and very foreign to me. And so I think maybe it's for people to look again and see what we can add to this culture and what that culture is and how much agency we have over that as well.
Mm. And
I mean, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come to that Thai context in a moment. Just wanted to pick up on what you said at the beginning of that answer about it. It would probably be put in the memoir section of a bookshop, but you're not very satisfied with that. What would you like it? Where would you like it to be put in the book?
Well, we talked a tiny bit about this writer called Siebold, and one of who's a German writer who's, there's something I heard about him that when he was having one of his books published, his first book published, he said, I want this to be, and he gave this whole list of things that it should be, like history, nature writing, and memoir, a bunch of things. And I feel like that, and it might be because I'm half Thai and I'm mixed culturally in all sorts of different ways that I don't want to be categorized, and I think we should be a little bit open to things being mixed genre. And I have the impression that nowadays there's less tolerance for that, and I'd kind of like to break that open. I don't think my little book's going to do it, but that's sort of it. The other thing that I was I was a bit amused by, but one reads reviews. I do anyway, and there was one which said, most of the reviews I read were very good, by the way, but one of them said that it was a valiant attempt at trying to write the history of this Thai family. But ultimately I failed. And I thought, had I really set out to do a history, well, it probably wouldn't have been me anyway. But had I set out to write history, yes, it would be a failure. But it wasn't that. It was something else. And it was trying to use all of the different materials at hand and building up something which I just had the good fortune to do, and that people were tolerant of. So, and it definitely goes back to how the whole project started, which is, I just had a child, and I was thinking about anecdotes and what I could tell them about where we come from and what his family is, and all of these things. And I was thinking about it more and more and started writing them down. And I realized that I could only get so far, and that they were quite thin as anecdotes. And I couldn't really place them. It was frustrating. I wanted to structure them. So I contacted other family members, and I thought, we should have this, because there's been quite a lot said and written about Bunnag family because of its position in Thailand. We should all have these incredible stories, and perhaps we could go all the generations back to a founding ancestor, and within each story there'd be a kind of germ of truth. So I was really interested in this idea, but I couldn't get anywhere. Mostly, and I say this in the book, but mostly people were only interested in like 2 or 3 ancestors, and or was incoherent, or it's just kind of fictional. So then I ended up having to look into the sources, and then I started to get more serious about it, and then I started to add things on, and the more gaps there were, because the records quite scant, the more I found like I'd be looking at architecture or food or or film or something else, and I found that I was going from something that was quite simple to something that was quite complex, and that's what became the book. So that's why I'm not so happy that it's just memoir, but it is.
Yeah, interesting to hear about that process and the gaps, which I think you were very conscious, and sort of reflexive about in the book. A couple of points that answer we'll maybe come back to later. You mentioned E.G. Seibold. We'll talk about him when we get to the photography. And also the fact that it was written during COVID, I think, is interesting. I just wanted to maybe explore really quite a fundamental point, which sort of comes out of this idea that there are gaps. So, Chariot of the Sun is about the past, and it is this is a valiant effort, as reviewer called it, to chronicle your family. But to me, it felt as much a reflection on the nature of memory itself, as it is about actually that specific history. So can you say something about how the process of researching and writing the book caused you to think about, perhaps rethink, the relationship between writing and the past?
Yeah, obviously there's a sort of organic process at play, which is kind of getting back towards my own family and getting in touch with them and trying to insert myself maybe a little bit into the story. But yeah, it's a kind of an interest in the historical mindset, which is something which is evolving over time. I mean, if I, when I started to look beyond, family stories and actually try to pin down things, you see how we actually have evidence of how we're changing as a culture and as a people. And, so in the Ayutthaya period, you have the sort of royal chronicles of Ayutthaya, which are like the scraps of records left over after the war with the Burmese, when a lot of the records were destroyed. And it's a very, very different way of expressing time and events and I mean the whole the whole mindset, the whole cosmology is very different. So you go through from that, and then you get into the Bangkok era, where it's sort of on the edge of modernity, and you have the early Bangkok histories like by Japriyachipa Gorawong of the first reigns, and you have various other kind of court historians, and then through that you go into the late 19th century. You've got Prince Damrong, which is much more like the national story, and then from then on, we have all sorts of other sources and different ways of expression. Within that, there's the technology. So if you look at the form of the book itself, and in the records, you're going from temple records. So you've got the Thai style book, which is like what do you call it, like an accordion. And then by the late 19th century, you've got the Western style book, which is looking like this. We have radio, newsreel, and then later the internet. And you have a kind of constant changing through the technology, which relates to the way we interact with memory. And I think there's a sort of tactile, bodily side of memory too. And we see that a lot with photography itself. Like now, most people will agree, or probably of our generation will agree that a lot of our memories are linked to objects and photographs, which may not be so much the case now. And so I think what's happening is we're constantly evaluating in the past through these, functions of the body and the way that we can feel them. Does that answer it all?
Yeah, I mean, memory is such a fascinating topic, isn't it? Because I think it's sort of, if you ask somebody what memory is, the kind of common sense or intuitive answer is mental active recall. But actually, as you just pointed out, there's so much else involved. Our engagement with objects, but also the way that technologies kind of both sort of enable acts of memory. But that I think in a lot of, your ancient legends about people worrying that like writing is going to stop people really remembering because they're, it's kind of replacing this natural memory. I think you see similar concerns now with, people say, oh, nobody reads anymore, and there's all this sort of instant gratification. There's a relationship there with the kind of speed of access, but also a worry that we're somehow losing something by having access to these materials as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about how, I mean, maybe as a parent as well, but memory throughout life is very different too. Than, there's a child's memory, a teenager's memory, an adult's memory. And later when, these sort of adult have this grand view of things that, where they could favor certain aspects. But really, we should be compassionate about the different forms of memory, as we should be compassionate when looking at history about different forms of memory. And in trying to put together a story, we'll try to not be condescending to them and to bring them into the story rather than judging and saying, so for example, in the, I don't know, well, let's say medieval period, people were expressing themselves like this, how ridiculous, how childish, but no, they just had a very different worldview, and they had, the pressures on them were very different in order to record things in a certain manner. So I tried to have that sensitivity to the past because, I think that's what is exciting about history, is that we're gaining an ability to look at something very different. Yeah, and there can be a poetry, there can be an alchemy in that discourse.
I mean, I was thinking also about the act of writing. You just said you wrote it and it got published, quickly. Well, quickly for writing. Of course, a book of that length is slow compared to many other sort of ways of engaging with memory. I talked about Ayutthaya. I was at Ayutthaya last weekend, and of course, nowadays taking digital photos, you're sort of snapping away pretty much indiscriminately, and then select one of a dozen that you took of one particular site as the best one. So, do you think? How do you see the role of writing in a world where so much is kind of fast now in terms of? It's great concern about AI. You can sort of produce content so fast now without an awful lot of thought if you just put a few AI prompts in. I mean, what are your feelings about the act of writing down a chronicle, in this day and age? What kind of value does that have to you, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relationship to time and attention. I think it's good for the soul. Like, even if you're not a very good writer, just get, with the pen and paper and just turn off everything else and concentrate on one thing and doing that regularly, like maybe every day. But I was talking to a friend in the UK who had, I guess he'd had various problems with his devices around him all the time and things that are going on in his life. And he was saying that his remedy for that was to read, like 19th century literature, like sort of, something like Henry James or whatever, like, very dense, long form. I think this is good for us. It, returns us to a stability. It's very hard when you have it's just captions, or if you're getting into AI. I've no complaint. Maybe AI will produce wonderful things, but I'm really interested in the process. I think what I want to find out my own solutions. One would want to explore oneself through the writing. And if there's a device that can do that for you, then what's the point?
Yeah. And I mean, while we're on sort of different media, in addition to writing, so, the book doesn't just consist of writing. There are over 100 photographs included in it. In some cases, these seem to sort of verify and correspond to what you're writing about. But in other cases, they feel quite opaque. They're blurred, which may be a kind of, symptom of their age or the technology. But regardless, in some cases, to me, it felt, they kind of increased rather than removed the sense that the past is kind of impenetrable. You mentioned W.G. Sebald. So for listeners, Sebald was a German writer, spent much of his career in the UK and taught at the University of East Anglia. And just as a interesting and slightly embarrassing detail, he actually supervised my undergraduate dissertation there.
Wow.
Because it was really not very good, so I kind of cringe. I think I had access to this org figure and I produced this kind of crap dissertation. That's not important now. But I mean, Sebald, as you mentioned, is the sort of genre of his writing. I think he referred to them as prose fictions, but there's sort of part blog, part memoir. They include these photos that kind of offer this promise of but then that's sort of withdrawn. You don't quite know. You're sort of staring at this black and white image and don't know what you're looking at. I had the same sense, at times looking at yours. So, I mean, how do you condense this down into a question? How do you see the relationship between the writing and the visual elements in your book, and maybe more generally as well?
Yeah, I mean, just continuing on from this thing about technology and AIs and whatever. I mean, there's extraordinary advances in the digital spheres, given us this access to information. I mean, without that, I wouldn't have been able to do a lot of my research because I could sit at home and Google stuff, for example. But I do think that books with images are still an incredible way of delivering information. And it's much more efficient. It's not just that it's tactile, but the way it's laid out, the liaison between elements, you cannot do. I have not seen it done with the digital, with a tablet or something like that. I mean, you could attempt, but I think there's still something very basic about that. And that, if it was just images, it would work better in digital, and if it was just text. But somehow those two things coming together. And it wasn't what I was thinking when I was doing it. I was thinking, although afterwards I continue to be impressed by the way there's a new form that I think there's increasing space for. That you used to be either it's a photo book or it's text or whatever, and then people were scornful of it. But I think that there could be another way of looking at this old medium and renovating it, let's say, renewing it. So that was part of it. But another is I come from a documentary and kind of fine art background, and in terms of exhibitions, you go into a gallery or something and things are well curated. You see the images on the wall, there's an ellipsis between them, but there's something else that emerges within you that can't be dictated by the person who's put the exhibition together. They could try to nudge you perhaps in a certain direction, but there's an alchemy. And I was interested in that in the book, that maybe it's not always about providing documentary proof, but it's about providing an atmosphere or feeling. So that's one set of ideas. The other is that, in approaching the book, I'd never written anything long form. I'd written a little bit, but nothing seriously. I was coming from documentary, which is my professional background. And I was thinking, how would I do this if this were a film? And thinking of the filmmakers that really inspired me, like Agnes Varda and Chris Marker and people like that. And feeling like, okay, I should just be free to do this my way without thinking, is it going to be, without thinking so much about the writer and thinking more about myself. And then, of course, when it comes out to the final piece, you do start to edit it down and wonder, like, how transparent is this? So that's kind of the place I was coming from with putting in the images. There was a complaint from certain readers that they didn't put captions in, and they didn't know where I was going with the images, or that they were obscure. And I that was definitely something I borrowed from Siebold, that the images could be punctuation, and that they could magnify certain things in the text, and maybe they shouldn't be explained. However, I did put at the end, that kind of most of the photographs are credited, because it's important to know what they are and where they come from.
Yeah. I think, talked about sort of speed already. There's an interesting thing for me about time as well, because although writing is a slow form to produce, and I guess in this day and age, a relatively slow form to read compared to like TikTok, right? It's still the narrative still takes you forward, but then you get one of these photos where it's uncaptioned, as you say. It's not, maybe the details aren't clear, or maybe even what it's showing is not particularly clear. So then you have to pause over it, and you almost don't know how to spend over it. So you have this kind of, space in the middle of this forward momentum where you can take a bit of time. Some, I guess, they're frustrating, but it does a strange thing to the rhythm of reading, I think, as well, which to me is interesting. Were you aware of that as you were putting them in, or is the experience of kind of collating these different elements a bit different to reading it, do you think?
No, I was definitely aware that there was a pacing that was going on, and I think that also comes from film, in montage, and that you can juxtapose elements, and then there could be disparate elements that create an effect, like the early Russian, like the Soviet cinema, where they cut, image of a cat with a man's face, and then suddenly you project onto that man's face something, that's that kind of idea. So yeah, the liaison, ellipsis, alchemy, those kind of things were at play. I had an opportunity which I hadn't seen so much before I started, but I knew that some 19th century photographers had taken pictures of these ancestors. But there's John Thompson, a Scotsman who's one of the was probably the first travel photographer, and then Nadar, there's like the most famous French portraitist of the mid 19th century. They've both taken photos of their family, so how could I not want to explore that? And plus, I'm a photographer, so I was kind of duty bound to go in that direction.
And okay, while we're on visual forms, at one point in the text you referred to Bangkok as the capital of voyeurism, and that's actually in the context of the conflicts and upheavals nearby in geopolitical terms in Vietnam and Cambodia, in the 20th century. Do you think it's the case that writing and reading history is always a kind of voyeurism. We have this safe distance from which to look at the past. And do you think there's something particular about Bangkok that makes it a voyeuristic city, or was it, when you referred to it in this way, was that just a case of the kind of historical contingencies that meant it remained relatively undisturbed while all of this was going on nearby?
Yes and yes. No, I mean, yes. Okay. So first of all, about writing and reading history, I think there's a voyeuristic quality. And I mean, you can see it in the kinds of histories that are written a lot and sell a lot. And they're often gelling around or coalescing around horror. So there's a lot of histories about the Second World War, Holocaust, and things like that are really shocking, and we know about, and yet we're still drawn to them. And I think one of the reasons is because memory is, we're quite basic in some senses, and through our body, and that memory is a bodily thing. So I was thinking about how like the English beating out the bounds. So in order, as they say, that in the old days they'd take children to the edge of the parish and hit them, and then they would then understand that this is the edge of the district, this is the edge of the boundary. And you remember that for life. And if you look back at, one looks back at childhood memories, often they're like unpleasant things, or they're around pleasure and pain. So I think there's already that aspect of memory, and then that transfers into history. Of course, we love histories that have salacious details in them, or that inspire emotion. And this can be problematic, of course. And then there's, so that's sort of on one side of history, and then there's Thailand's position as a voyeuristic place. I think certainly in the 70s, there's something very peculiar going on. And if you look at the structure of the book, I was going through the decades and through the generations and trying to bring up to the present time. So by the time I get to that part of the book, I'm in that, kind of Vietnam War era thing. But it's very curious. In the early 70s, you've got Saigon, Phnom Penh falling like within months of each other, a month of each other, whatever it is. And then there's Bangkok, where, as I know through family, like people were having a jolly old time. They were partying. I mean, and yet there was, talk of Vietnamese tanks reaching Bangkok in weeks, and there's going to be a revolution and everything's going to collapse. And yet they continued with all of that momentum that had built up over, the Vietnam War, the R&R scene, and the go-go bars, and pleasure. It's curious. So that's one part, and then
Sorry, just very curious to me, like, how palpable is your impression? How palpable was that sense of threat? And do you think that hedonism was a kind of response to it? From talking to people who were around at that time.
I think it was very palpable in that, one of the exciting things about being in Bangkok in Thailand during the 60s was that, there were extraordinary people coming from all over the world, because, there were incredible journalists and photographers coming through, and filmmakers, and then of course all of the diplomatic staff, all of the experts coming through were there because of the war. So there was this, there's a flowering of culture in a sense in Bangkok. But also imagine when those things were going wrong, those same people were attached or living in Thailand, were bringing back stories. So I think we were very aware, and then also very blinkered in a very Thai manner. Like, well, what are we going to do? We should just. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, let's enjoy ourselves, kind of thing. But certainly, I don't think it was spurring anybody to action. It's hard to say. I mean, I talked to my uncle who's in Thailand at the time. He was an historian, and he said, "Oh, this story is about." I may have put it in the book. I don't remember, but this story is about the communists taking over. It's complete nonsense. Like, it really wasn't the case at the time. It's really overblown. Hard to say. I think then on the aspect of Thailand being voyeuristic, it's also its position. So in terms of diplomacy. It's the saying, bend like a tree in the wind. So it was always like weaving and winding through circumstance and standing a little bit outside of it and never really taking sides. I think that's part of Thailand's skill. And the other is that geographically, we've been blessed, not in a seismic zone. We don't get hit by typhoons. We've got mountains and rivers protecting us and the neighbors. You can sort of look out at everybody else who basically have always been much more vulnerable. So it engenders a mentality. I'm not critical of that, but I think it is. Yeah, maybe that's why.
Yeah, interesting insight into that particular period. Yeah. Thank you. I think this would be a good place to pause. So we will end the first section here. Please do join us for part 2. We'll go on and talk a bit more about the structure and also the context in which you wrote it, which was during COVID. So we'll cover those in the second part, and please do join us for that.